This is the Dane Moore NBA podcast brought to you by Prize Picks, coming at you Wednesday afternoon. It's May 8th, and we're back in Minnesota for an off day in this Wolves Nuggets series, but it's kind of been an eventful off day. Rudy Gobert was named Defensive Player of the Year on Tuesday night. So this morning we had a Gobert press conference, and then we also had Wolves practice after that, where Kyle Anderson said this about Gobert winning Defensive Player of the Year.
Rudy gave his award here.
Yeah.
What that means to him and to this group.
Yeah, that's special, man. It's well deserved, and he's really anchored our defense all year, and he's really improved himself. And guys said that he can't switch on the guys and guard on the ball or guard smaller players, and he's done that this season. So it's really special and really well deserved. I think this is his best one.
I think this is his best one yet. I kind of got my gears turning, so I'm going to run through the numbers of Gobert's now 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards, try and see if this was the best. And then Jace Frederick is going to join me for the, second half of this episode. We recorded that part at the Wolves facility this afternoon. We basically just kind of spent a half hour reflecting on the last 12 months for the Wolves, and honestly just got into how we never really saw this coming from the Wolves to this degree, at least not this fast. But before we get into the Gobert Defensive Player of the Year stuff, wanted to quickly remind you all that Kyle Tighe, Britt Robson, and myself will be doing 2 live shows this weekend. Both are going to be outside Thursday night at Falling Knife Brewing Company in Northeast Minneapolis. We're going to do happy hour at 6 p.m. and then a live show again outside at 7 p.m. That's Thursday, tomorrow, the night before Game 3. And then on Saturday, the day after Game 3, we will be doing another live show at Dual Citizen Brewing in St. Paul. Happy hour for that one will be, again, Saturday at 4 p.m., then live show at 5 p.m. So Falling Knife Brewing Company in Minneapolis on Thursday, then Dual Citizen Brewing Company in St. Paul on Saturday, kind of wedged in between the games on Friday and Sunday. It should all just be a fun time, and a fun time with this Wolves team. This is going to be, a pretty memorable Wolves weekend. Would love to see many of you out there. I can't wait. But let's start this episode off with Gobert winning Defensive Player of the Year, and the question of, was this Gobert's best Defensive Player of the Year season of his career? So Rudy Gobert has won DPOY 4 times in his career: the 2017-18 season, the 2018-19 season, the 2020-21 season, and then this season, 2023-2024. So I spent some time this afternoon after practice looking at both Gobert's individual numbers from those 4 seasons and his team's defensive numbers from those seasons. And obviously I have to use numbers here, some because I only had the chance to watch this season up close, the 3 Utah seasons. I know he was great, but I can't say I was watching Gobert close enough to get a feel for the size of his defensive impact from like the eye test like I have this season. But I think the case for saying this was Gobert's best Defensive Player of the Year season is made by talking about this team, the team defense. This season, the Wolves had the best defense in the NBA by a wide margin in terms of points allowed per possession. And I'm using Cleaning the Glass's defensive numbers for all these team stats because Cleaning the Glass removes, those blowout fourth quarter minutes, the garbage minutes we talk about all the time. I don't think that's very relevant in assessing team defense. So we're using those. But this season, the Wolves were the best, again, by a wide margin. The Wolves' defensive rating this year was 108.9, and the Celtics were in second at 111.5. If you go back to the 2021 season, Gobert's last DPOY season, the Jazz were also first at 107.2, but the Lakers were close. They were close second at 107.9. If you go back to 2019, his second DPOY season, the Jazz were also first, but again, by a relatively small margin ahead of Milwaukee. And then in 2018, his first DPOY, the Jazz were actually second in defensive rating, a hair behind the number 1 Celtics that year. Also, if you just look at the Wolves defense, maybe you don't think like looking at 1 versus 2 is a great way to look at that. That would make sense to me. But if you look at the Wolves defensive rating this season versus the league average defense this season, the gap is 6.7 points per 100 possessions. And you're like, what does that mean? Well, that's a huge gap. And it's the largest gap of any of his 4 DPOY seasons of where, the Jazz ranked against the average defensive team, or the Wolves this year versus the average defensive team. The Wolves were just a significantly better than average NBA defense this year. And you can't say that about every one of Gobert's other DPOY seasons. So I think the case is at least at minimum strong that this is the best defensive team Gobert has ever been on. And obviously he's the head of the snake there. The case for saying Gobert has had better seasons as an individual defender is about that impact on the court versus off the court. I think that's where you see it show up kind of statistically. And in Utah, those numbers were big, especially in 2021. That on-off differential was massive, 12.1 points per 100 possessions when Gobert was on the floor defensively versus when he was off. So that's cool. That's a big number. But what that also kind of says to me is that Utah just didn't have a good defense when Gobert was off the floor that season. How much credit do we assign to Gobert for that versus blame you put on the GM for not having many other good defenders? I don't know. That's subjective. That's why this is kind of hard to do. What we do know is that Gobert's biggest on-off differential on defense came in that 2021 season. The second biggest differential came in 2018. This season was the third biggest differential, and 2019 was the smallest differential. And that on-off differential, it has a pretty big impact on those individual catch-all defensive metrics that we look at. You know, I reference defensive estimated plus minus often because I think it's imperfect, but it's probably the best individual catch-all defensive metric we have. And you see Gobert kind of slide down the DEPM rankings this year. He was 26th in the league in defensive estimated plus minus. That's not really a DPOY mark. Jaren Jackson Jr. won it last year. He ranked third in DEPM. But again, 26th this year. I think that kind of overstates it. I was just looking through the list of the 25 guys who had a better DEPM than Gobert this season. 11 of them played under 25 minutes a game. I mean, think of him. Nickeil Alexander-Walker was one of those players, but he didn't play one of those 11 players. He didn't play 25 minutes a game. It's not to say he's not a good defender, but how do we compare those type of players against guys like Rudy Gobert who are playing 30 plus minutes every single night? So I removed them. That 26 probably overstates it. So amongst guys that played 25 plus minutes a game this year, Gobert ranked 15th in DEPM. If you go back to 2021, though, the year he had that incredible on-off number of 12.1, Gobert did rank first in the league in DEPM. It was a crazy, crazy individual stats season for him. And I think for making a case for another year, that's probably the strongest one. Back in 2019, Gobert also ranked third in DEPM amongst players who played 25 plus minutes. And back when he won his first one in 2018, Gobert ranked second in DEPM amongst players who played 25 plus minutes. He certainly had better individual statistical seasons than this season. And if you want to make the individual defensive case, statistically, you have ammunition. 2021 was statistically a better defensive year. But, at the same time, we should recognize those numbers aren't perfect, right? That's the whole, was it Rudy or was it the GM sort of thing? I don't know. You balance that out. Team defense or individual defense? What should we be weighing more when we're thinking about this? Again, I don't know. That's up to you. But just to me, looking at these numbers, thinking about this season, I think if you fuse the team defense element together with the individual defensive element, I think you can make the case that this was at least Gobert's second best defensive player of the year season of his career. Again, maybe behind that 2021 season. But what I also want to say or bring up is Gobert's age. I mean, even if we come to the conclusion that this is just one of Gobert's best defensive seasons of his career, that's still pretty impressive to do at 31 years old. His first award he won at 25 years old. His second he won at 26 years old. And the third one, that 2021 year, came at 28 years old. Those are all much more physical prime ages. I think that's probably a note just in general with Gobert that we don't talk about enough. This, for Gobert to sustain what he's doing, even if we're just calling it sustaining, to do that at 7'2" and into his 30s, I mean, that's a pretty impressive thing and something I don't think I talk about enough. Best defensive player of the year or not, this has been a hell of a defensive campaign for Rudy Gobert, and I think he's certainly doing it on the best defensive team he's ever been on. So congratulations to Rudy Gobert, only the third player in NBA history to win Defensive Player of the Year 4 times. And then quickly, just before we bring in Jace, a reminder that this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. And I was looking at the slate for Wolves Nuggets game 3. I actually really like a Gobert offensive number. His total for points in game 3 is set up at more or less than 12.5. Yes, Gobert only had 6 points in game 1, but man, rewatching that game, he was open. Rudy is open on the roll against Denver's defensive coverage. I like him to get a handful of easy buckets in game 3 and, mix in a couple tough ones with offensive rebounds or whatever. I probably think that's enough to get him more than 12.5 points for that one. So if you want to make a daily fantasy lineup for game 3, you can do so at prizepicks.com or on the PrizePicks app. Use promo code Dane when you sign up, and you will get a $100 sign up bonus. All right, we are now joined by Jace Frederick from the Pioneer Press. Jace, we're doing this here at the Wolves facility because we were just at Rudy Gobert's Defensive Player of the Year press conference. And I was just kind of thinking about, at the press conference, how far this has kind of come in a year, which has obviously been a thought on all of our minds for a while right now. But it reminded me, I was telling you before we started recording, of the pod we did, me, you, and Chris Hine after game 5 of the Nuggets series last year when the Wolves got eliminated by the Nuggets, and the result of the series in many ways was viewed as an indictment or the indictment of the Rudy Gobert trade. And I think we kind of certainly perpetuated that with our thoughts there. But at the time, I also don't think any of us thought we were being reactionary. It kind of was where this team felt like it was. At that time a year ago. So I'm just kind of, I know this is a broad topic, but just to start, over the past 12 months, how have you kind of thought about your own thoughts evolving, not only about Rudy Gobert, but about this team as a whole, and probably being something that the both of us, didn't think it was ever going to become, at least this season?
Yeah, I think for me, and frankly, like right after that game, I think it was pretty easy to be reactionary. And I think like that even Ant asked him like after game 4 in Phoenix, like, hey, you were pretty despondent after that game 5 last year. And he's like, yeah, like never fun being eliminated and stuff. He's like, I think I cut myself a little slack when Denver won the title. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of a thing when you watch Denver kind of roll through the rest of the playoffs. It's like, it's probably the way that some people in Phoenix are feeling a little bit now after watching the Wolves play 2 games in Denver. It's like, okay, this still obviously isn't good enough, but maybe it's not as big of a train wreck, and maybe it had more to do with the opponent. But even still at the time, like when the Wolves lost, I always viewed this thing with Rudy just because of his age. And now like with Mike being a big part of the team, his age of like, yes, this is a young team. Yes, they've got a lot of young players who will be a part of this team's future for a long time. But you look at those guys, you look at Kyle Anderson, like where is their window? And it is kind of right now. So I think at the end of last year when it doesn't go the way you want it to, it's like, well, there's 1 year, and how many do you have? 3? And that was kind of it. It was like, this is a ticking thing here. The clock is ticking on this. So in my mind, like, this type of leap would have had to have happened almost to have made this trade kind of worth it, and it has happened, and it has worked out, and they have come so far. But to me, that's what had to happen because, like, how many years of being phenomenal does Rudy have left? Like, it was his time was now. And Mike, we say that we see him talk about that all the time. Like, this is my time, basically, to get this done. So there was a kind of a sense of urgency, and I think it was hard to say after the first round last year that, like, well, there you go. Next year, they're going to be title contenders, because it's hard to go from that, even health-wise, from 42 wins to that point.
Right. And, I mean, for me, dating back 2 years to the trade itself, like, where my head was at and why I didn't like it initially was the timeline it put Ant on. Right. I was like, you're at the time trading for a 30-year-old Rudy Gobert. It seemed like a timeline move for the Karl Anthony Towns window, and maybe it was going to leave your, cupboard barren of assets by the time Ant got to, 25, 26 years old. And I think when I do reflect on all of this, that's the part I missed the most, was their vision and belief that Ant was ready to be that 25, 26-year-old version that we were picturing back, that we thought would eventually come. They kind of preempted that and jumped on it right now. And that's, I don't know if they get 100% credit for that, but it totally has come to fruition, right? And obviously who Ant is already right now at 22 years old. But I think even a year ago after that game 5, and I think it's important to remember, they're eliminated. Ant hasn't yet signed his extension. Jaden hadn't signed his extension. Nas hadn't signed his extension and everything.
Yeah,
and
Nas was just going into free agency.
Right. Like, I mean, and you knew Ant was like going to come back, but I knew I was hearing a lot of things about like, because Ant was still at the Clutch at that time. Like, if he was still at Clutch, he certainly doesn't sign a 5-year with no player option. I mean, there's definitely rumblings of like him maybe signing a 2+1 for his extension rather than doing the whole thing. So I think that was just, they lose in game 5. Like, yes, it's a little reactionary and all that, but I think for me, a lot of my reaction at that time was about, thinking about how the summer's going to go and what even group are they going to be able to bring back the next year. Is McDaniels going to sign the extension? It's just kind of all down the line and how they were going to, to fill it all out. But again, to their credit, they executed on every one of those questions. Then Rudy gets better, and then Ant makes a leap. And now you're here. And those were kind of the things, this organizationally from, Tim Connolly in the front office to Chris Finch and his staff were saying they believed in happening the whole time. It just is interesting to sit here and be like, oh, that stuff was actually right. You know what I'm saying?
And I remember like Tim, and I think everybody believed this too at the time, like when they traded for Rudy, it was almost like a way to ensure that Ant played important basketball games. And I don't even know if they thought that by this year, Ant would be one of the better players in basketball at this moment in time right now. But that, hey, if we can play in second-round games, that these will all help his ascension. Like, this will help his development as much as anything else. Like, even if we don't have as many assets in 4 or 5 years from now, like, Ant will be better in 4 or 5 years for having made pushes right now. And that has come to fruition, certainly. To me, it's just like the whole thing is that he is as good as he is now, where it's like, oh, well, maybe we can go in the Western Conference Finals and the NBA Finals. Like, how's that for development? Like, he just has developed, like, and a big part of that is the people around you as well. And Rudy certainly plays a pretty big role in that too. Everything does always kind of come back to Ant with this team. There's no question about it. And his ascension has made this work for like Rudy and Mike and all those guys, like to where they're competing for a championship. And certainly they have played big roles in like his development too. So it has been a thing where it's been mutually beneficial for all involved, which isn't always the case.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about. I talked a lot about the bullets in the chamber thing. I know you wrote about that a couple weeks ago, or not a couple days ago. And I think that is just like the perfect representation of what had to happen in this, which is like Ant had to learn to play unselfishly, to trust his teammates, to when a coverage is designed to guard him in that way, to get off of it, which as recently as 4 months ago, he was directly on the record repeatedly saying, no, I need to be more aggressive through this. And in so many words, saying to not, trust his teammates. But what has evolved since Christmas, that was about the time, well, that was the time when he started having those quotes, is his trust grew and his belief in his teammates grew. And so like that element had to happen too, right? Like right. Rudy had to get better, that the organization had to trust in Rudy and empower it enough to run it back. But then Ant had to get to the point of becoming the guy, and to be the guy is not just, scoring 35 or whatever. It's doing it within the context of the team. And yeah, just when I reflect on all of this and the many ways of where I have been wrong or had the timeline of this all wrong, like that's what it is. It's that shift that he's made, and so many things kind of had to come together. But Ant's evolution there in tandem with the belief in Rudy is what I think has evolved. I mean, honestly, you were on that bullets in the chamber thing months ago, even before I was. But how are you seeing that kind of show up in these playoffs with Ant?
Yeah, I mean, he's making all the right decisions as he was like the last month of the regular season. And I remember at that time I was thinking like, this is awesome. This is exactly what you'd always envisioned for Ant, and just how basketball should be played and how Chris Finch talked and what they wanted from him and all of that. And then my only question was like, how's he going to do like playoff time, like when it's easier, like the pressure builds, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we thought he was going to devolve.
Or at least revert somewhat.
Revert,
like in some way, shape, or form, and he just hasn't. And he hasn't even when, like, they haven't played too many close games, but even when they've had those moments, he hasn't then either. So it's been amazing. And I think the thing is, like, if you're like a Tim Connolly, you trade for Rudy Gobert so you can get to the second round, and then if you lose that way, like, it's like, all right, but that will spark an ant development.
Yep.
And he did this with, I mean, frankly, he did it when Carl got hurt. Like, that's pretty clear. Even Chris Finch has said that. Usually it requires, like, we lost because you didn't do that in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, that's when the epiphanies occur.
We talked about that, of like learning through failure. And I assumed that's what Ant was going to have to do. He was going to have some series where he just tries to over-aggression himself, to trying to put the team on his back and do that, in his own ways. And then it ends up being, an 8 turnover game in Game 7 when they lose to whatever. Like I thought that was going to be the beginning. I thought that part was going to happen before we got to this part that we're at. And quite frankly, I find it pretty incredible that it hasn't required that. Yeah,
it is amazing. Like, I don't think you can give Ant enough credit for being 22 years old and making just a sudden jump like that. So many guys take so many years to figure out. I think that would have been impossible to predict. I think one thing with, like, the Rudy trade that I don't even think was necessarily on, like, anybody's radar, even from, like, an organizational, how they viewed it, but just, like, I wrote about this for today's paper of, like, how, like, whenever you think, like, oh, Target Center's really jumping and stuff now, I'm always like, it was jumping 2 years ago because people loved watching that team play. Yeah. And it really hit back in my head when Chris Finch was like, after Game 2 in Denver, like, we want guys to compete. We want guys to step up and play no matter what, next man up. And, like, we just mostly want a team that's people like to watch play. And people really loved watching 2 years ago play.
Yeah, the Pat Bev, Vando, Beasley, the year before the Gobert.
Because those guys just flew around. They just flew around the court, and, like, there is no way that roster, like the guards, like D'Lo, Malik Beasley, Jalen Noel was playing 15 minutes a game. Yeah. That should have been an atrocious defensive team. And they were 13th in the NBA. Mm-hmm. Like, Cat was your big man, which at that point you were like, you probably can't have a top 20 defense with Cat as your center. And they found a way to make it work because they just played hard, and playing hard covered up so many deficiencies. So I guess if I was like an organization looking at that, I'd be like, Chris Finch and his coaching staff squeezed the 13th best defense out of this roster.
Right.
Like, let's get them the best defensive player in the NBA and see what they can do with that. And sure enough, like, and they've added other pieces as well, but in large part, like, you put Rudy with these other guys and you let them kind of, it took a year of transition. I think that's pretty common now looking at it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Phoenix, even if they just ran it back, was a little bit better next year anyway. Sure. But you see now, like, okay, it's like what frankly looks like a historically good defense because this coaching staff gets guys to play really hard. They get you to follow a game plan. They get you to, do the right things and understand matchups. And now, so you give them a great pieces and the puzzle looks even prettier.
Yeah. It's the foundation of effort is what this team has outside of Gobert.
Right.
And that's what started that season. That's the fly around. That's the high wall. That's the scrambling stuff that we're seeing, honestly, that we saw in Game 2 because they had to play a lot more that way. I mean, I was thinking about that watching the game back, and I was like, yeah, this kind of does feel like the 21-22 Wolves, like Cat's involved in every action as the big, Jaden and Ant are the ones flying around, which they were both kind of like learning that back then. It was like Malik Beasley and Pat Bev and Vando were really the effort guys who kind of, I think those guys started instilling the effort culture.
Sure.
Finch at the top. Finch at the top of all this of like going to Vando and Pat Bev. And honestly, he rewarded those guys.
Yeah.
Vando, Pat Bev, and Beasley with heavy minutes because they had effort. All of those guys started with lesser roles. Vando and Pat Bev not in the starting lineup. Maybe Beasley even.
Beasley did not start, but he played a lot of minutes.
Yeah, but they kind of, their roles grew as they gave effort. I think Ant and Jaden, guys like Nas kind of like fed on that. Cat turned out to be, kind of more aggressive coverage was his best thing. And I really do think that's where the foundation of this defensive evolution started, was with Finch.
Yep.
And then was empowered, emboldened, whatever, by adding Rudy Gobert to that at the back line, which in and of itself is still like a risk of being like, okay, we're going to put the most conservative rim protector in the midst of the most chaotic, like external thing, but that's
Right.
in 5 minutes. Like, I think that's the way to describe how this has all evolved, because it didn't just start last year. It started a couple years ago.
Frankly, even like Ant's rookie year, Finch came and kind of like they put a lot more on his shoulders, and he just succeeded a lot more offensively. You know, he scored like a 40-point game in Phoenix and all that stuff, and it was like, okay, here we go. And then there were games where he wouldn't finish because he would sit on the bench because Chris Finch would be like, yeah, didn't like his defense.
Right.
You know, like that kind of stuff where it's like, nope, that's going to matter here. You're going to be held accountable for that here.
Ant said as much after game 2, right?
Yeah.
Like, he was talking as Finch was like, hey, Ant and Cat, like, if you don't defend, we're not doing anything. And I could totally picture Chris Finch saying that to the both of them many, many times over the past 2 years. And that respect that they have for Finch, like, has, I don't know, I think they've just come to trust Finch and believe, like, hey, we should probably listen to him.
Right.
Because when in the times when we have, there's been a benefit that's come out of it.
Yeah, 100%. And like that, it is where like the great defensive effort they had 2 years ago, like you do hit a ceiling of like, well, we still don't have that much defensive talent, you know, like
Yes.
we can, so teams can eventually exploit it. They can find ways to exploit it. You can make it very hard, but like the great players will figure it out to where now if you have a team that just has like a number of top 20 NBA defenders,
Right.
And they are playing with that same effort, and you can do so many different things because of the versatility they have. Like, yeah, this is what you get. So when Finch says that Rudy instilled the defensive culture, I agree to a point for sure, because even like last year's team, when it looked like they weren't figuring it out to start, like Rudy was like, we need to do this and this and this. But man, I do think the coaches deserve a lot of credit for it too.
I really do too. Let's get into the series a little bit more. Since we last recorded after game 2, there was question marks about a Murray suspension, which he didn't get. He got a $100,000 fine. I don't think there's too much analysis to put into that, other than Jamal Murray's, going to play in this game. But knowing that they do have Jamal Murray, which allows them to press the full veracity of the buttons that they can play their way. What do you think Denver needs to do in game 3 to start pulling themselves back into this series? And then in turn, what do the Wolves kind of need to have their eyes open for, to be ready for that punch back from Denver?
I don't know. I think Denver's going to have to, if I was Denver offensively, I would just lean into as many like off-ball actions as humanly possible.
Yep.
Like I would have so much Michael Porter, running through 2 screens, whatever, because I do think like Jamal Murray bringing the ball up the court, obviously he's not at full strength. I don't know what health percentage he's at, but he's just clearly bothered in this series by the Wolves defense. And like, so I think it's so hard for him to gain even an inch on the court that,
sure.
like, I think kind of running like him and Jokic 2-man game, which I know is kind of their thing, is just, I don't know if it's going to work, like even the shots that he hits, like they're tough. And I understand he takes a lot of tough shots, but like it clearly is not sustainable offense for them right now. He is clearly getting frustrated by how difficult everything is. So I really wouldn't be surprised at all if it's like, hey, Jamal's going to have it up top, or Jokic is going to have it up top, and they're just going to kind of conduct, but it's mostly going to be off like KCP, Michael Porter Jr., whatever, like trying to tax Minnesota off ball as much as anything, because simply attacking on the ball, they just don't have anybody who can get a step on you right now with the ball in their hands. Like Murray couldn't get a step on Nas. Like, so it's really tough to play offense that way. So I do think it has to be a bunch of off ball stuff. Like if you're in college, like picture like a Princeton type thing,
sure.
Like that is the approach that if I was them, I would try to lean into and at least see how it goes.
Yeah. It's kind of been interesting to me, like how little they've hammered going to like one thing over and over and over again.
But what have they had success with that you think?
Yeah, they'll just be like when I was rewatching game 2 yesterday, I was kind of like watching it, like trying to think of that, being like, oh, this is something that did work for Denver. Why didn't like they go back to it? Why didn't they go to like one thing that early on in the game, when the game was in the balance, like they started entering whoever Ant was guarding off of Jamal Murray, that guy would enter the ball into the post, and the Wolves to Jokic in the post. And the Wolves' defensive strategy clearly in that game was the man guarding the ball goes down to double Jokic from the top. Mm-hmm. Well, as we know, Ant is good at certain things defensively, others he's not. And that's like one of them. It was just he would kind of half do it, and it was like, and that's where if you give Jokic that little bit of space, he's going to take advantage of it. And he did a couple times, and he finds a cutter through because Ant hasn't totally like collapsed the space there. Just little things like that where I'm like, okay, so in my head, and I don't know, maybe this is just levels of complication above that, I would just go, well, the Wolves defense is clearly their plan is to double it. So I'm going to make sure that it's the guy who Ant is guarding that's going to do it every time and not Jaden McDaniels.
Right.
You know, because if Jaden or Nikhil come down, the way they can double with their size and aggression and all that stuff. But there's just been this, actually, you were saying this to me when we were sitting in the game too. There's been this like, I don't know, Denver hasn't been really like meticulous. They're just willingly switching defensively too.
It's maddening to me. That is like watching like Christian Braun when he plays, like he's not like their best offensive player by any stretch. So when he plays, he's basically in there to like guard Ant. But then it takes the simplest action. Like Minnesota, it's not like even deliberate. Like
it's like
dribble
pistol.
hand.
It's like literally just like interchange.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly
it.
what it is. It's maybe a dribble handoff. It's maybe like literally an interchange that is almost like a mock screen, but not really. And they just switch it. Now Ant's on Reggie Jackson, and Ant goes and scores. You know, and it's like, well, then why is Christian Braun even in the game? You know,
Right,
I don't understand it whatsoever. You're right, and it's just they're just not. It doesn't look like they're detail driven right now. You know,
which is that's the. I don't know anything behind this, but like I get like the sense that there's more going on there than because it just doesn't look like what I'm used to Denver looking like. Even Denver like a couple months when I love watching Denver. I've watched them a ton this season, and the word we would have used if we wanted to just talk about a Wolves Nuggets game in January would have been like, well, they're playing Denver, super detail oriented. The Wolves need to be really meticulous to go do that. So it's like, I mean, and part of it to the Wolves' credit,
yes, I don't want
they're taking them out of their detail orientation.
I don't want to like sit here and be like, well, what is Denver doing? Denver stinks, like blah blah blah. Like Minnesota has a lot to do with that. I certainly understand it, but yeah, they're just things we watched during the game where it's like that just doesn't make sense. You know, like even of what you should be trying to do, that doesn't make sense. So that has been a little weird.
Yeah, I don't know, like. And Mike Malone has said that in his press conferences that we've been at. Like after game one, he was like, we didn't do anything we talked about doing in the first quarter. So I think there's some truth to them just not playing to their typical identity, though the Wolves are probably making that happen as well, given the aggression with which they're
them
playing
in general.
And then maybe Denver, because of injuries or whatever else, is just like when flustered, more easily rattled or something, because they're clearly playing rattled. That game was over in the second quarter, not just because the Wolves were up by 20, but because of the body language of the rest of the group. I was talking to somebody at halftime. They're like, well, the Nuggets got a second half run coming in them. I'm like, I don't know, dude. I'm pretty sure Wolves are up by 26, and like I'm not ruling out the Nuggets, but like that doesn't look like the Nuggets. The Nuggets did not look like the Nuggets in game two. So
you can tell when a team is like, I know like Minnesota sports fan will sit there and be like, well, you can blow any lead, like, whatever.
Sure.
But it is like when you watch a game, you can tell when a team is dead. It's like Minnesota could have fallen off details wise, and I think even Carl was saying in the post game, like, after the game, we were a little bit like, I think we let it slip a little bit in the second half.
They did.
Yeah, and it didn't matter because Denver's toast, that was
or
it.
was toast in that game.
Yes, I'm not saying they're dead for the series. Maybe they will find some inspiration in game 3 and look like the Denver Nuggets, because even Minnesota at its best, like, I'm not saying they couldn't beat Denver a bunch of times, but like they would be more competitive than that game was.
Right. Like we were talking about this series and giving the Wolves a real chance to win it, but in 7.
Yeah. And a bunch of hard-fought games, and like game 1.
Sure.
Like Denver maybe would say they weren't crisp in game 1, but like both teams were.
You
pretty
said to
good.
me after the first quarter, you were like, the first quarter of game 1, you said, I thought that was going to be what the entire series was going to feel like, where the Wolves start off up 18-4, and then it's 21-5. I was like, oh yeah, I do agree with that, and it did seem like it was going to be that until I guess Rudy had a baby and everything changed.
So I don't know what to expect now moving forward. I don't know because like Denver looked discombobulated, but maybe that can be one bad game. But when it's one bad game in a game that you desperately need at home, when Minnesota is missing the defensive player of the year, like it can go two ways. You can kind of be like, I don't know. But there are 3 days off, and maybe they will regather or have a team meeting or whatever. But they have to be more detail driven for sure. I almost suspect, I can't think Denver's coaching staff was like, yep, Reggie and Christian, any type of action, you guys switch that. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they're usually switching partners and just not paying attention to the personnel, not accounting for the personnel, and maybe, whoever is over on the sidelines for Denver assistant coaches like pulling their hair out. I don't know.
Yeah. I think one thing to point to in Game 3 that is going to be different than Game 2 is, Rudy is going to be back.
Right, and that's where, so the Game 2 stuff you were pointing out, what's interesting is Denver has to throw that out. Yeah. There's no real film maybe what Minnesota does offensively.
Well, when Rudy's off the floor, maybe the Wolves, can they tap into that?
12 minutes or so there. Yeah. Because, if Rudy is roaming, they are not going to double Jokic because Rudy's already roaming. So that part is it is only applicable when Rudy's off the court.
Yeah.
So it's okay, Denver, adjust again.
I think that the more interesting reintegrating Rudy part of it is on the offensive side of the floor. I think a big part of the reason why Cat in particular was able to get going early and often in that game was not having Rudy in the dunker spot.
Right.
It really stood out to me in Game 1. I said afterwards, Rudy was there on rolls all game.
Yep.
In Game 1, and the Wolves were just not really passing it to him. Short roll, in the middle of the floor there, that was open, and the Wolves opted not to go to that, to prioritize other things. Remember, Rudy had 2 points until I think he finished with 6 points, but he basically wasn't taking any shots in Game 1. He was just playing defense. But it's if you don't hit Rudy on that roll there, then he kind of just matriculates into the dunker spot, which inherently is partially in the way of Cat or Ant getting downhill. So I'm just thinking, and I don't know what the right answer is, but if I'm the Wolves coaching staff, I want to get the same Cat in Game 3. And how do I get the same Cat with Rudy on the floor offensively? Or what is the most you can do there? And as we've kind of learned for 2 seasons now, Rudy being on the floor puts a little bit of a ceiling to Cat's offense, right? It just inherently kind of does with the getting down, with Cat getting downhill game. But that would be the thing I would be intentional about is all right, can we effectively position Rudy out there so the offense can be as good in Game 3 as it was in Game 2.
Yeah, and they're we've always talked about hey, can you just put Rudy in the corner? And then people will be well, it's not a kick out option, but then you can play other things off of that.
Yeah.
It could be oh, okay, open kick out to an
almost
open,
even kind of towards the slot, like the edge of the corner.
Yeah, to give yourself some room, because then if you kick out to an
then
open,
you just get into a DHO with Mike or whatever.
100%. Yeah, kick out to an open Rudy, and now it's a DHO where Rudy is an easy screener and Mike gets an easy corner 3.
Yeah,
stuff like that.
Maybe for next round too.
Yeah,
I think it could become relevant at some point if they get.
Those are kind of always the things we've dreamed about for the Wolves offense. So I don't know if we're all of a sudden going to see it now here in Game 3 when everything is.
But if we were running the team on 2K and you were Gobert and I was Ant,
we'd be doing that January. Yeah, we would have been doing that January. I don't think it's something that's going to happen, but if you're wondering,
it's a good. You could picture it, right? And just again rewatching Game 2, it was just clearly a nice advantage for Karl to not have somebody in the dunker spot. So when he attacked, he could attack. And Karl looked awesome driving to the basket.
Right.
All he's got to worry about it is as one guy.
Yep.
And Karl was doing a good job of that. And there wasn't that second rim protector help coming over or guy in the gap. That is big. And obviously we're not saying Rudy takes away from anything. It's just you had a really good Cat offensive game, and it's not a complete coincidence that Rudy wasn't out on the floor. And that's just been a thing for 2 years.
Yeah, and that has always filled into the sacrifice Cat has made. There's no question when Rudy is out there, your offense will not be quite as good. Just with given the personnel that they have and the strengths of those guys, but what's the trade-off is the best defense we've seen in a decade plus.
Great trade-off. The trade-offs for sure there, and I still believe that the best way to guard Jokic, if you're the Wolves, is to put Cat on him and have Rudy in the spy.
No question.
To Cat's credit, I thought he did a great job in Game 2 in that one-on-one. Ant and the players, the coaches were kind of Cat and Nas really just guarded him one-on-one. And I'm watching him back, and I'm a lot of doubles from the top.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it was just a different thing. Like the guard, like we were saying with Ant, kind of coming down from the top rather than Rudy coming over from the baseline. It worked. It totally worked what they were doing in game 2. But if we look at now what are we at, 14 game sample size against Denver, I think we still know the best way to guard Jokic and the Nuggets is with Cat on Jokic and Rudy there in the lurk. But maybe now you found something, again, to your point, for the 12, 15, whatever, non-Rudy minutes in the game.
It is like you hear that a lot. I've heard that on a few national podcasts, and I do think there's validity to it of like Minnesota knew probably like at their practice the day before that Rudy had a very good chance of not playing, or at least they should prep for it. And like you can always just revert back to your game 1 stuff if he does. And Denver's kind of blindsided by it.
Yeah.
Not as much time to prep, so Minnesota had time to implement these things of like, here's what we want to do, doubles from the top, all the stuff like you said. And Denver's seeing it and they're like, all right, this is not. We have not really game planned anything in for this.
They were probably just like, okay, if there's no Rudy, like, let's cook. Like,
but
go
like,
Jokic.
even still, when that came out, like, Denver doesn't have shoot around or anything. It's just like, so pregame meeting, here's what we're going to do.
That's a good point. Yeah. No, if they were totally blindsided by that, then, I mean, you knew what your plan was for the non-Rudy minutes, but when the non-Rudy minutes go from being 10 to 48,
right.
that is a big shift. So to that point, they're going to be more ready for that look.
Sure. Yep.
That's not a complicated look.
Right.
Doubling from the top, like that, Denver and Jokic, provided the shooters are making some shots, which I do want to note, Aaron Gordon, like in the first quarter, took 3, made 2, maybe made he made a couple threes in the first quarter that got him going a little bit. I remember like when the game was in the balance, I was like, oh, well, if Gordon gets going in this game because it's a different look, maybe that'll help in the future.
I thought he pressed after that too, though, and it was because nothing else was going. But
right.
I felt like that it almost like gave him a little bit of a confidence to where he was probably taking shots that aren't in his game anymore. But I mean, like the biggest thing for Denver is like it's the easy solution of like if Aaron Gordon can take 8 and make 4, like I'm not saying that will always happen, but if you take 8 open threes, like that probably is. Maybe Denver has to be like, well, we have to just see, in a game like that. But I think the problem with that was that he took open threes and then started taking other things that weren't.
Right. And like in that, again, during the regular season, like worked too, where they were like finding Gordon on little cuts or even just offensive rebounds. But that's where the Wolves like effort and staying attached thing is really showing up here. Like the way they're guarding a Gordon cut in this playoff series is very different than the way in which they're guarding a Gordon cut in Game 80, because like, they don't have to think about, we played the Bulls 36 hours ago and now I'm moving into a new scouting report. This, like, again, to the Wolves' credit and to the personnel's credit, like they are very dialed on the game plan specifics of this opponent, and that's that's going to make it tough. But I do think Denver has more offensive answers for the Wolves defense that, if they don't get frustrated by it early on in the game, I think you'll see a better Denver offense in game 2. I think the question is becoming, do they have enough defense to slow down the Wolves offense enough? Like it's just been kind of easy for the Wolves to score in these 2 games. Aaron Gordon hasn't been anything to really slow Ant down. I mean, when we're talking about Christian Brown being the best option, it just like it's kind of weird. We've always talked about the Wolves like, there's a mediocre offense, so the defense has to be great to kind of have a positive point margin. But now it's kind of like, I mean, they're playing like a, I don't know, top 8 level offense if they were 17th during the regular season.
I mean, it is a continuation of everything that Ant learned to do in the last 6 weeks. I mean, that really has been it. It's just carried forward, and it's like, so now when his shot is falling the way it is, and he's making all these great plays for others, like, it's hard to not have a great offense when your best player is playing at that high of a level.
Right. We got to go into Wolves practice here in a couple minutes, but just anything stick out to you from Rudy's Defensive Player of the Year press conference from this morning? Anything he said?
It's a lot of things that we've talked with him about before, but he's talked about how much it meant for him, and I think this is probably like really into like Chris Finch and Tim Connolly, because I think they believed it more than anybody else. He's like, even through the struggles of last year, they continually believed in me, and we know like we've talked about the stuff with like D'Lo before, and I think even Ant probably had his doubts at some point about, was this the right move? Is this the right approach? But Chris Finch and Tim Connolly have been steadfast in it from the very beginning of like, nope, we're going to make this work. It's going to work. And they did, and it's paid off. And I think Rudy just appreciates that there was really no wavering on their part. They were never like, Finch would never be like, we got to bench Rudy here for this matchup, anything like this. Like, and now, like, now that it's worked, everybody, like all the players and whatnot, like, Rudy has really enjoyed this environment too, where this team all really likes each other and likes Rudy, and he feels that love. So like, I think him saying that was a little bit like, this wasn't like this in Utah. I think he's made other statements that have kind of been, veiled references to that.
He said after the game too, he's never had like the teammate camaraderie. I mean, he made it. I always just kind of from the outside looking in thought everything was all kind of peachy in Utah. Like
until
it seemed like
until
a team
the end with
cult.
the Mitchell stuff.
Yes, until that. Yeah. And maybe he's just pointing to or hinting at the Mitchell stuff there. Do you remember that after Rudy punched Kyle Anderson?
Yes.
There was that like video
I remember
leaked
that.
out. Remember that video leaked out where
yeah.
Kyle Anderson was like, he's like screaming down the hallway. He's like, y'all give him too much like freedom or whatever. And, and I don't know, it was Kyle was saying that there. And clearly those two have cleared up their relationship and are in an awesome, awesome place.
I don't think I can say like enough about how good of a place they're in.
Like,
I have people
for sure.
be like, these two are like
buddies,
friends. Like, really good friends.
Absolutely. But I think what Kyle was talking about, caught in his emotions at that time, was like, Finch and Conley and everybody has this like his belief was, you're giving him too much. You're giving him too much credit.
You're not holding him accountable enough, like as much as everybody else gets it, because Rudy wasn't quite as good last year.
And that is like definitively a growing pain.
Yep.
And it looked like a lot more of that, which to bring this full circle is, and to be honest, we hear about things too. So like we were hearing about things like that before the end of last season. And so it's just, I say it all to mean to be an incredible credit to this group of in 12 months elevating to where they've elevated through. And I do think it is fair and accurate when Rudy or anybody on the team says we had to come through adversity and we have. There was plenty of adversity going on within the walls of this facility, last season. And for them, Conley and Finch at the top, and then the top players on the roster to kind of come in with that mentality of like, we are going to put that behind us. I thought that would be a hell of a task to complete, and absolute credit to them for doing so.
Big momentum that they gained at the end of that Denver series, just being competitive, like you really carried forward for
sure.
them, which I think is huge. And
it inspired the belief that they have right now.
And any doubts that anybody had last year, including us, about all of this working, like Rudy played at 75%, it seemed like last year, and it was, and like there had to be
about that too.
Some worry, right, and like, and to a big degree, it's like, well, is he just it's just a guy falling off?
Yeah, remember when you pulled up DeAndre Jordan's
I was
stats?
pulling up guys, and I was like, wait, it wasn't around like 32, 33 for these 7-footers, like maybe he has hit that, and it obviously wasn't. He just never like back stuff, and he's just never fresh. Like, so now he's 100% Rudy Gobert. That is a massive difference too. Like it probably that. Like, if you get 100% Rudy Gobert last year, they probably still win 47, 48 games just because,
Yeah, I mean, I remember we were sitting in this room doing Rudy's end-of-season press conference, and he was like, I'm going to have my best, I'm going to have my best summer of my career, and he needed that to get healthy and to get back on track, and he did. I mean, physically, just like tonally in his body, you could tell coming back. So, yeah, I just wanted to take some of this time to give credit to think back on the last 12 months, but had a lot more bumps, and 18 months since the trade or whatever, a lot more bumps than maybe even everybody knew about, and they did keep pretty zen with it all, and
the organization did.
Yes,
organizationally, Tim and Finch did. Yeah,
even Keel. How many times has Finch said that over the last 12 months? And they have done that. So, all right, Jace, this was fun. We're gonna go into practice now. Appreciate you doing it. Maybe we'll make something happen next week. Jace has some great stuff going on up at the Pioneer Press. Make sure to read all of that until tomorrow night, Thursday night at Falling Knife with Britt and Kyle. He's Jace. I'm Dane. Peace out.
How I'm feeling, man, I hope it never stop, yeah. Green and hot so you can find me in the crowd, yeah, yeah. Don't let standards ever bring you down, yeah.